Halloween. Time for the Halloween Bellringer. Whoa, that's some spooky stuff on this Halloween Bellringer. Yeah, you took the test yesterday, and now it's time to move on. Remember, you could take that test as many times as you wanted. I liked seeing that a lot of you did. I had people went back up to 10 times to redo questions on that test. But it's Halloween, and so no tricks, just a treat for you today. We're gonna talk about the cell membrane. All right. Hey now. Mr. Kovacs class. It's Mr. Kovacs class. You might learn a ton. It's Mr. Kovacs class.
He's interested too.
It's Mr. Kovacs class.
And he's super cool.
It's Mr. Kovacs class. Yeah, the basic unit of life is the cell. We've learned that right in the beginning, and we've been spending some time with some cellular chemistry. Like we've been studying things like how enzymes work and stuff like that, and acids and bases and those kinds of things. But the cell is a pretty simple, right? It's basically, as I told you before, a bubble, and then some cells have bubbles within bubbles, right? The bubble is outlined by what's called the cell membrane. Every cell has a cell membrane. The cell membrane, really its primary job is to control what goes into and out of the cell. It also has some secondary roles as well, which we'll learn about, right? All right, so the bubble of the cell. Now if we zoom in close to that cell membrane, there it is. You'll see it's made up of lipids. Okay? In fact, these lipids are what we call phospholipids because they've got a phosphorus group on their heads, which is actually hydrophilic, likes water. And then their tails, which are fatty acid molecules, fatty acids, the monomers of lipids, they're hydrophobic, right? So the cell membrane is what we call the phospholipid bilayer, where the hydrophobic tails line up with each other and the hydrophilic heads point away. What's cool about that is because they're hydrophobic, okay, it doesn't mix with water, but the surface of the membrane can interact with water, right? And so that's important. That way it always lines up this way, right? If you zoom in even more, you'll see that there's more things on the cell membrane besides just lipids. There are lots of proteins embedded in the cell membrane. There are cholesterol molecules in the cell membrane. There are glycolipids. There are carbohydrate molecules that are attached to the cell membrane or sticking up. There's a lot going on in cell membranes, and we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty and we'll study the cell membrane. It is arguably the most important part of a cell because it controls what goes in and what goes out. Okay. One cool thing about the cell membrane is that it's fluid. It's fluid. So like it can smush and bend and even pinch on itself. This is called endocytosis. This is one way that cell membranes can take things into cells, is by basically just wrapping themselves around things and then pinching themselves off, and you've got a little bubble inside of a bubble, right? You've got a thing now that was outside of the cell, now inside the cell. This is how cells often pick up big, humongous things. And they can work the other way too, right? They can work the other way too. They can do what's called exocytosis, which is where if they have a bubble of like proteins that they made, they could send those proteins to the surface, and you see how the cell membrane kind of fuses together because it's fluid, and that releases all of the insides out into the intercellular space, right? So cell membranes are fluid. We sometimes call this the fluid mosaic model, the plasma membrane, right? It's a fluid with things floating in it, right? But one thing that doesn't happen is water doesn't mix. So you can't dissolve these with water, right? So things like water that are polar can't get in and out of the cell membrane very easily. And so the cell membrane has to have things to help that, like protein channels that would allow water to move in and out of the cell, right? Since it can't get through the cell membrane because the cell membrane is hydrophobic, right? It has lots of different proteins that we'll learn about, okay? It can get kind of complicated, but if you just think of the cell as being bubbles with inside of bubbles, and the bubbles are made out of lipids, you'll do just fine. So let's talk about lipids today, shall we? And today's Halloween Bellringer.
Happy Halloween. Yeah.